Ian Johnson was known as Myxomatosis, and this matters because Ian Johnson was one of the few bowling captains Australia has ever had.
This is the last knock. My dad told me to say this.
In fact, he was probably the only one to lead the Australian team 10 times who wasn't at least a bowling all-rounder. Even if Johnson was clearly a frontline bowler who could still bat a little bit. He wasn't a popular captain. He seemed to be given the job because he was a safe, diplomatic pair of hands. During his reign, Australia played 19 tests, but he only led them in 17 of them, winning 7 and losing 6. But in those losses were 2 Ashes series defeats, and Pakistan also beat them. But why his nickname mattered is because Ian Johnson was called Myxomatosis because others thought he brought himself on to bowl at the tail, or bunnies. And myxomatosis is something that kills rabbits. If you compare him to the bowlers of his era, Johnson took 73% of his wickets from top 7 batters, which is around average. But that was when he wasn't captain. When he captained, it was 64%. Meaning that there was a lot of extra tail wickets in there. So those numbers might sound like he took more wickets against the tail. But weirdly, when he was captain, he actually brought himself on earlier, meaning he bowled more often against the top order. He would bowl first and second change 60% of the time as captain and 53% of the time beforehand. It would be easy to say that if Johnson killed anything, it was the notion that Australia could be led by a bowler, which they had been quite a bit up until that point. Except for the fact that a few years later, Richie Benaud got the job. Like in most things relating to bowling captains, things are very complicated. There are quite a few reasons why captains are usually batters, but the most obvious must be the mass. 54% of players are generally specialist batters. Add the keeper in there as well, and only 37% of players in games are specialist bowlers. And none of this takes into account all-rounders. But we all know in tests that you don't get bowling captains 37% of the time. If you look at captains who are purely in the team to bowl, of all leaders with 10 plus tests, 4.3% are specialist bowlers. 4.3% are bowlers. Keepers have done it 6.8% of the time. Adding the bowling all-rounders and it goes up to 11%. That means 73% of the time players captain as batters. They're doing well, aren't they? Even before we look at the many reasons why it's complicated for bowlers to lead, there's a pretty obvious reason batters do. They have little else going on when they're in the field. Keepers and bowlers are doing a job in those innings already. If you had a hypothetical situation where you like 2 candidates equally for the captaincy, and one was a batter and the other a bowler, the batter is probably the better choice. Although, having talked to a lot of bowling captains in my life and being one at a terrible club level, I've never really found it that difficult. Everyone else seemed more upset about it than I ever was. However, you can't overlook the fact that the history of our game has played a part in all of this as well. Batters were captains at the start of cricket, not because they were tactical geniuses or their lesser workload, but because of the class divide of English cricket. When you hear the phrase, cricket's a gentleman's game, they don't mean men. Gentlemen are the males lucky enough to have gone to a very good English public school, which is a private school, sorry if that's confusing, and they could play cricket as an amateur. Those players were often batters because, well, bowling is hard work. So the leadership jobs went to the well-schooled chaps with the family connections, and they were mostly batters. So there was a built-in system within the game that led to bowlers being seen as less worthy for the higher office. That's over. But we still pretend bowlers aren't as smart as batters. And they're still thinking that to be a bowler, you need to be a great athlete. Well, to be a batter, it's more about skills and smarts. Of course, if that was true, you'd think we'd see more spinners as captains. But only 6 of the 18 bowling dominant leaders I could find are actually spinners. This shows that it's more inbuilt into the fabric of the game. This isn't just a case of don't give the ball to the big fast guy. And while Cummins is a great athlete, it would be hard to watch him play, or how he has developed as a cricketer, and not believe that he's an incredibly smart player. When he was injured as a youngster, he went and turned himself into a T20 hitter in his spare time. His bowling method is almost a perfect culmination of modern styles, and vastly different from the 18-year-old we once saw. Cummins is clearly a thinking player. One of the most common reasons for not giving bowlers the top job is how many overs they might deliver. Anyone who's played any level of cricket under a bowling captain will complain that they either bowl too much or occasionally not enough. Australia's only seam bowling captain, though he was probably a mixture between spin and seam, was George Giffen, the all-rounder who captained Australia 4 times. In those matches, he averaged 59 6-ball overs a match, over a third more than what you would expect from a frontline bowler. He delivered 30 overs a game when he wasn't captain. He was a classic case of someone who kind of ruined bowling captains. But that's not how modern cricket works. Giffen couldn't bowl that number of overs now, and really, outside of a spin bowling captain, no one would even try. Before Cummins goes out on the field, he will have times when Australia is going to use him. Usually, he replaces Stark after a short first spell around the 8th or 10th over. That will be his primary overs. But he'll bowl another decent spell around the 40 to 45 over mark, and then one more before the 80th as well. He also won't bowl 60 overs in a test, although Cummins has bowled 65 overs in a match once, in a Sheffield Shield final as an 18-year-old. What a way to kind of ruin the most precious commodity you have in your cricket. Currently, Cummins bowls 38 overs a match, which is high, but Australia is a 4-man attack, and I wouldn't expect that to change too much with him being a captain. The problem is when things go wrong. He is the best bowler, and he might just keep pushing himself. But that also happens now when he is not captain, as we saw from some long spells against India. It also happens with Jimmy Anderson and England, and he's also not captain. Your best bowlers tend to get over-bowled. That's part of the job. With Cummins as leader, Australia will probably watch this even closer to ensure it's not a problem. Whether he bowls too much or not, he'll still get tired from all those overs. That is something that happens to bowling captains. Cummins might be less affected as he won't have to spend as much time out on the boundary, which is often where quicks earn extra miles, but you can't discount the tiredness. But as players get fitter, I would assume that it's less of a concern than it might have been in the amateur era. Tiredness was arguably the main reason against keepers leading, and they have done pretty well. Before MS Dhoni, it was common to say that keepers couldn't captain. Their job was too hard. They couldn't focus on anything else, and they were just tired, and you wouldn't risk the important job with one of them. Well, Dhoni has won some World Cups from behind the stumps, and India were the #1 test team under him as well. Plus, countless first-class teams have been led by wicketkeepers over the years. Not to mention Tim Paine himself, Australia's first long-term keeper captain. As I said before, 6.8% of the captains of over 10 test matches were wicketkeepers. But that doesn't include a lot of the players who actually end up as batters later on in their careers, like Brendan McCullum and Kumar Sangakkara. It's quite clear that standing behind the stumps actually gives you a very good perspective on being a leader. And with Cummins as captain, people will still point to the fact that bowlers have to think about other things on the field. But all that applies to keepers who have to think every single ball. If keepers could overcome their burden to lead, it would make sense that bowlers would as well. But there are obviously still stigmas within the game, probably dating back to the old ways of thinking. Batters are seen as these tactical geniuses now, though it's worth noting how often they are outthought by bowlers. But everyone has their favourite what-if bowling captain, who displayed genius in the field. But in truth, all bowlers spend their entire lives working out how to dismiss batters. Many batting captains only start to think about this when they actually become in charge of a team, or get senior. But one thing we have to factor into this particular story is the Australian nature of this. Many teams have tried keepers or picked players they thought were the most strategically minded to lead. England has 2 captains who were chosen purely as specialist leaders, Plum Warne and Mike Brearley, while Australia has steadfastly gone with the rule of giving the job to the best batter in the team or nearabouts for a very long time now. There is actually sound thinking in this. You probably only ever have around 3 dead certainties in your batting lineup. And if you've decided that keepers and bowlers can't lead, then they are your 3 options. Picking a batter who won't get dropped unless something unexpected happens means you at least have a solid leader for the next 2 years. Of course, a lot of this depends on how you view captaincy. If you think of captaincy as art, then why would batting really well mean you're good at managing people, tactics, and the many external pressures of the job? However, I would say that strategy is probably overrated in tests. Unless a captain is lucky enough to have 5 frontline bowling options, most test bowling changes are given because someone needs a rest. The batting order very rarely changed, and being that we don't have much data on how much fielding moves help or hinder teams, there's not a lot to go on other than anecdotes and what you personally like when it comes to how good a captain is. So with all that said, Australia's method is reductive as it's only batters, but it might ultimately make sense from a continuity standpoint, and teams are always telling us that that is quite important. However, everything I have just said, let's remember that Australia's most respected captain on and off the field, and also on TV, is Richie Benaud, a bowling all-rounder. Imran Khan was as well. Darren Sammy won 2 World Cups and changed how T20 was thought about, and he started as a bowling captain. Lasith Malinga won a T20 World Cup as a specialist bowler. Dan Vettori was a bowling captain and probably the last player coach, at least unofficially, a major nation will ever have. By my count, and a lot of this is subjective, we've had 7 specialist bowling leaders of 10 tests. Bisham Beatty, Courtney Walsh, Bob Willis, Ian Johnson, Waqar Younis, Anil Kumble, and Fazal Mahmood. This group has led in 120 matches. They won 41, they lost 42. That's virtually par. Of course, that said, this is a comically small group. These numbers could be completely random. And if you factor in the bowling all-rounders, players like Shaun Pollock, Wasem Akram, Kapil Dev, you get 18 bowling leaders, and they have won 87 matches and lost 101. But there is an important thing to note here, because most bowling captains, even the bowling all-rounders, are only given the job in an emergency. They don't land in good situations. They are thrown whatever is left, and they have to make do from there. Often their teams have weak batting, because if their top order was making runs, it wouldn't be an emergency, or they would have given one of the batters a job. But I do think there are modern day reasons why picking a fast bowler as captain may not work that well. We're moving closer to the baseball platoon system in cricket, where we rest our fast bowlers to ensure that they are as fit and sharp as they need to be for each match. Cummins himself looked spent by the fourth test against India in Australia's last home series. Stark, he looked done by the third. Australia is already resting their fast bowlers by not allowing them much time in bilateral white ball series. So there is little left to rest Cummins from. There is also an IPL career that may complicate all that. Not that batting captains haven't been rested from series before. Andrew Strauss had some rest when Alistair Cook took England to Bangladesh in 2010. But Cummins is a fast bowler, and they are losing their chance to rest him mid-series without some complications. But it is undoubtedly true that cricket has probably missed out on many great bowling captains over the years. And perhaps it'll be hard to have too many into the future, especially fast bowling ones. Cummins is clearly smart enough to lead Australia, but he will do so only having captained in 4 games of professional cricket ever. And he also has a couple of 100 years of history and cricket lore to overcome. Oh, and Pat Cummins' nickname is Cider. You can often hear the Australian players calling him this. It's problematic in a different way for Cricket Australia, as it means come in, side her. Cummins, cider. Cummins, you get it, hopefully. This has embarrassed Cricket Australia before, but now it's coming on the back of what's happened with the last 2 captains. They lost one because he put sandpaper in his underwear, and they lost the other because of what he took out of his underwear. The pressure on Cummins to lead a very imperfect team while being a perfect man is staggering. And the reason that Cummins has this job at all is because of something that he was probably very well aware of, if not slightly involved with. Almost no one within cricket thinks that the bowlers didn't know about the reverse swing plans in South Africa. It was their ball, their wickets, their jobs on the line. When Donald McRae interviewed Cameron Bancroft, he said as much. Of course, then Cricket Australia went to work ensuring that that story fizzled out. But in my mind, Cummins is the Australian captain because of a cheating scandal in which he was very much involved with. But here's the thing, the moral gymnastics of that would seem to be a lot harder than bowling and captaining at the same time. There's a lot of pressure on him. He starts with the home Ashes, and the entire country hoping he doesn't make another major error while also winning, while people are going to be looking for every failure just because so many people don't actually believe that bowlers should be captain. There are many reasons that Cummins might fail as Test captain. His top 7 is decidedly shaky. The bowling lineup is a decent chance of being overworked and could unravel with even one serious injury. And the team hasn't won an away tour since 2016, and they have 4 victories in their last 15 away trips. This is not a consistent team, and what it really needs more than anything else is their best players starring. For Pat Cummins, the captain, to be successful, he needs Pat Cummins, the bowler, to continue to start. But if he doesn't work out as captain, it will probably just be seen as another public failure for the idea that Australia, or really almost any team, can be led by a bowler.